So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at trade integration, and it's really going to sort of look at take sort of broader look at it and talk about economic integration agreements. So these are, as we all well know, agreements that lie outside of the dome that are exempted under WTO rules, where you don't have to sort of extend the same access to everybody else who's in WTO. Right? Now we know that the number of these agreements has grown quite rapidly over time, quite a lot over time, but we don't really know precisely the impact they've had on fairly disaggregated patterns of trade. So we're going to take a look at product level patterns of trade. So in Keith's language, yes, this is meso level. It's not quite micro because we don't have firm level data. Right? So this is sort of take a look at the fraction of bilateral country pairs that exist in the world that have some sort of economic integration agreement over time. Our data is going to start in 1962, and there we're looking at well less than 5% of all possible country pairs you can create that had some sort of agreement, and that has gone up to about 22% by 2005 when our data stops up. And there's some sort of well-known increases. This is sort of the expansion of the European economic community back then. This is the breakup of Eastern European countries that created a lot of countries without any sort of economic integration agreement. This is not a consequence of a lot of agreements are sort of falling apart. And later I'm going to show you sort of how much trade is embodied in all of these. So in terms of literature, there's a fair amount of literature sort of at aggregate level trying to understand why countries sign these agreements, what is their aggregate impact. And at this aggregate level, there's not a whole lot of work. So there's one paper by Anderson Europe who look at 2 or 3 digit sectors, I think 2 digit sectors. I think there's a couple of sort of very specific country approaches to it with a couple of firm level data sets. What we're going to take a look at is what is the effect of these agreements at the level of a trade relationship, or actually more disaggregated level of a trade spell. So for us, this is going to be an exporter and importer product triplet. And we're going to look at and focus on the spells of trade, which are going to be consecutive years while this particular relationship is actually active, when countries are actually exchanging this particular product, or when the exporter is exporting to the importer. Then we're going to take a look at what's the impact on the initial volume of trade in the first year when these spells start, their length, how much they grow while they're active, and then at the end we're going to take a look at the entry rates and what happens to these in the wake of an agreement. Why do we care about this? So we know from aggregate studies, so the Bayer-Bergstrand strain of the literature, that trade agreements double trade in about 6 to 10 years, or in about 10 years. So total trade goes up by 60 to 100%. We don't quite know how this happens once you start thinking about disaggregated patterns. Does everything that you have simply double, and you end up having double the level? Does it mean you start some new trade relationships that weren't around before? So we really don't know how this increase actually materializes. So we're going to plug it into several chains of literature. We're going to plug into the duration of trade literature, the growth of trade, and this is sort of micro-based growth of trade, either product level, firm level, not aggregate growth of trade.
So I think world trade grows at around about 6% a year. 1.06 to the power of 10. 1.07 to the power of 10 doubles in 10 years.
Sure.
So these trade agreements don't help much in terms of trade growth beyond what's happening on average.
Well, this is, I guess, then that growth on top of whatever you would get in without doing it, right? This is the outer treatment effect that you get in aggregate studies. So short of, take it out of the trend that you otherwise get at the time. And in terms of the sort of theoretical component of the paper, we're going to have a dynamic model of trade. There's a few dynamic models of trade on the extensive margin, seeing how things come in. There's not that much on the intensive margin. We're going to have a model that looks at the intensive margin changes, and then we're sort of plugging into these few papers that are sort of looking at the buyer side of things. All right. So in terms of the preview, we're going to develop a dynamic model of trade. And this model and the results will show us that countries that at some point end up having an agreement tend to have their relationship start with larger initial volumes. They tend to be longer, but they also tend to grow more slowly. When you sign an agreement, when this agreement kicks in, so think about the U.S. and Mexico signing NAFTA, everything that's active at the point of the activation of the agreement actually becomes longer, so it becomes less likely to cease, to stop. It actually starts growing faster. They grow more. But an agreement will make everything that comes after, or everything that comes after agreement looks worse, in the sense that they start with lower volumes, they're more likely to stop, and they grow less on average. Okay? And we're also going to show that the agreement will actually increase the rate of entry, rate of creation of new relationships within that particular country area. Right? So we need a model that's going to explore how trade evolves over time. We're going to focus on their size, duration, and growth. So fundamentally what we do is we take the Klepper and Thompson I model of markets and embed it into the Middleton and Tibiana framework. So there's two countries. Firms pay a fixed entry cost. They're going to draw their productivity from a greater distribution. There's iceberg transportation costs, and the tau is going to be our trade cost that gets affected by trade liberalization. So firms are going to export only when their cost inclusive of transportation costs or trade costs is below some sort of cutoff level above which firms will leave the market. Right? So we're going to have a fraction of firms as a function of that cutoff and the transport costs or trade costs. There's going to be some distribution of sizes of these, relationships that get created, and we're going to have some expression for the expected size. So I'm not going to sort of delve too much into equations. If you want to look at it in the paper, the functioning version of the paper that's being printed out. And in terms of buyers, so the way this model works is that markets in the destination country are comprised of a number of buyers. And these buyers arrive following a Poisson process with parameter lambda. Now these buyers also die off over time. Right? There's an exogenous rate at which they die off. And so the life of each buyer is randomly drawn from an exponential distribution. Right? Trade spells are actually an aggregation of various kinds of buyer relationships that you actually acquire. So a trade spell for us is going to be essentially a set of buyers you have acquired in the market, and that size of that trade relation, that trade spell grows when you acquire new buyers over time. It goes down when these buyers die off. And so in each period, a trade spell can sort of grow. If you acquire a new business relation, you're going to become larger. You can lose a business relationship. You can lose a customer, for example, and you're going to drop down in size. You can sort of do both, right? You can acquire new ones, you can lose the old ones. These trade spells can be both created and destroyed. So you can sort of start with a trade spell. You acquire the first business relation, and over time you acquire new ones. You might be losing some. If you end up losing all of them, you're going to go out, you're going to die, you're going to drop out of the market, you're going to exit. It also is possible that after some period of time when you're out of the market, you acquire new business relations sort of back in the market. Yeah.
So volumes change because of this extensive margin of relationships only, or things happen within the relationship as well?
No, the size of the relation, the business relation is constant. So the total size changes because you acquire new ones, or you lose.
Except when you change, if you change tau, then that would change endogenous things.
But are they heterogeneous? If they're constant, but are buyers heterogeneous?
Buyers?
The size of any given relationship is
It's given.
it's just given. It's the same.
It's the same. Yeah. So the active trade spells are then characterized by the number of business relations they're composed of. We're going to call it M. Have the length S, and then their size, which is a sum of all of the size of all of the buyer relations that you have, and however many you have. So here's sort of the evolution of what sort of happens within the model. So if you acquire first buyer, you're going to have first business relation that's going to give you some size. Over time, you can acquire a new buyer relation. That's you're going to acquire a new business, a new buyer. It grows the number of business relations within the spell, and it grows the size of the spell. And then these buyers sort of leave you at some exogenous rate. And so over time, depending on how things happen, you can have the size of the spell is growing, it's decreasing. At some point, it's possible that you completely lose all of your relations, you lose all of your buyers, and you're out of the market, you're no longer around, and then you can acquire a new one, and you sort of come back into the market. Right? So the model allows us to sort of think about, to talk about these relationships that are active and then drop out and sort of come back again. Okay? So this is sort of a bit different than, for example, Penguin's model that sort of has experimentation and testing of waters, but once you leave a country, once you leave a market, you never go back to it. in this model, it can actually come back. And so what we care about is sort of is the length of these, it's going to be the growth of trade within these, and it's going to be these initial volumes which they start. So we have a set of results. So the first two results we're not going to touch empirically because we don't have the data. So the first result is about the distribution of traceable sizes. Has a certain mean and variance, and all depend on these buyer relations, which we don't observe. So our data is SITC revision 1, 5-digit level. So we're not going to sort of try to say anything about this because we just don't have the means of doing that. The survival, the length of these trade spells is going to be a decreasing function of the number of buyers or the business relations that you create. That also we can't touch because we don't have the data. I guess we can sort of play with aggregation of the SITC to higher levels, but I didn't feel like that was particularly necessary to do. The third result is something that was sort of knowing the duration literature that we're going to verify again in 5 seconds, and that is that for any spell you have it that it's decreasing in its size, so that the likelihood of a spell ending is decreasing in its size, so the larger the spell, the less likely it is to stop. And it's also less likely to stop the longer it's been around. So the probability of exit is decreasing both in size and the length of current duration. In terms of growth, we have the conditional and survival. The growth rate of a trace spell is strictly decreasing in its size, conditional duration, and it's strictly decreasing in its duration, conditional on size. Right? So these are sort of results that we have about duration of trade and growth of trade, irrespective of sort of trade liberalization. We're going to take a look at what happens when you have trade liberalization, you sign one of these agreements.
Is the militant Taviano part of this at all, or is this really all about this Poisson process of arrivals and departures?
Mostly it's driven by the Poisson process.
Yeah.
So to me, it sounds very statistical, and it doesn't sound like it really is driven by an underlying model.
So the only reason you need the underlying model is because you're going to do trade policy. Other than that, the process could evolve with any given size R and any given probability theta. But if you want to understand the effects of trade policy, then you need the underlying model. But that's exactly right.
So what liberalization will do is it will increase the probability of obtaining a new business relation. It becomes more likely to acquire new customers, new buyers. It's also going to increase the average size of a business relation. So that's sort of the growth in the intensive margin that you're getting because of decreasing the cost of it. Now, in terms of identifying these effects of any sort of agreement, we sort of have 3 basic types of spells in relationship to an agreement. We have spells like spell A here that are around before the agreement kicks in. So if this is NAFTA in 1994, this is you have U.S. imports from Mexico that started in 75, stopped in 79. It's well before NAFTA is ever around, and so these sort of exist before and are never impacted by the agreement. There's spells like B that start before the agreement kicks in, so it starts in 1990, for example, and goes through 94, and it keeps going under NAFTA for some period of time. And then there's spells like C which start under NAFTA. Start at some point after the agreement is in place. So we have sort of 3 results for this that pertain to liberalization. So the probability of a trade spell having exactly K business relations at time T increases. So once you sign a liberalization agreement, it's going to be more likely that these active relationships grow. The liberalization is going to increase the size of existing trade spells. And new trade spells are going to be smaller in the wake of liberalization. So we put all that together, what we end up getting is that trade liberalization will sort of make active stuff larger and longer lasting, and the things that start after the agreement are going to start at lower volumes, and they're going to grow more slowly, and they're more likely to exit.
And the last bit is where the model actually matters, because they're sorting, and the good guys are in there, the big guys who sell a lot are already in there. Right?
That's exactly.
Yeah. So given this framework, the only general equilibrium effects on other countries' trade is through the price index, but there should be effects, right? Basically, when a pair of countries sign an agreement, then it in effect makes it harder for other countries to enter that market. So their cutoff should, so their spells actually should have effects as well.
Not now. Good.
Yeah, so the reason why we're looking at the Melitotalians with the intention to incorporate that part that you have, so that we have this measure of competition kicking in the creation of market. But this is like the simplest version that can explain the result.
Yeah, you know, I don't think you need, there are straightforward knowledge.
Yeah.
All right, so in terms of data we're going to use, the trade flow data come from Comtrade, so it's a 5-digit SATC revision 1, so annual between 62 and 2011. So it's the longest panel we can get our hands at. The agreements information comes from Scott Byers and Jeff Merchant's database on economic integration agreements. So they have it from 1950 to 2005. So given our constraints, we're going to be looking at 62 to 2005. That's the time span that we have, and then we're going to use the set-B gravity data to get the standard gravity information in there. Now, in terms of the nature of the agreements, there's 6 types of agreements. In the database, you have non-reciprocal PTAs, free trade agreements, customs unions, common markets, economic unions. Right? And so in terms of the information on sort of all these trade flows, we have just under 30 million trade observations on trade flows. These are annual observations. Slightly more than half, so for about 7%, we have no information agreements. And this is because Jeff and Scott didn't bother giving us a historical database on economic integration agreements. So they didn't look at, they didn't go back and code stuff for Soviet Union because they're no longer around. Right? So there's some countries that we have trade flows on that we don't have agreements information on. So for the remaining 27 plus million observations, slightly more than half are in countries that have no agreement whatsoever. And then the most representative agreement is the free trade agreement followed by the non-reciprocal PTAs, so on and so forth. So we have all these kinds of different agreements, and at least in this first pass, we're not going to care as to what kind of agreement two countries have. We're just going to code for a generic agreement. There's an existence of an agreement, and then at the end, if I have time, I'll show you why that's the case. It's just these sort of transitions between different kinds of agreements are going to end up being messy to deal with. All right, so in terms of how much trade is in trade agreements, so this is looking at the share of trade observations that are within agreements. So we started in 1962 with something like 15%, and it goes all the way up to about 40% in terms of the volume of trade they account for. You start from about 20%, and you get up to 55% in 2005. In terms of sort of the unit of account, there's about 3 million trade relationships. And these can occur more than once. So there's a bunch of instances when a relationship is active, goes up, is dormant for some period of time, and comes back. There's about 2.3 spells of service per relationship that we observe. Slightly under half of these are single spell relationships, so they're active just once. And once they go out, then they'll come back. 22% of them 2-spell. Less than 7% have 6 or more active spells. In terms of the length of these spells, the vast majority is in every other duration paper. The vast majority are short, so 55% of them are 1 year long. You just see them for a year. And there's very few that this is, so less than 7% of them are 10 years or longer. So none of this is new results in terms of duration. In terms of how we're going to do this empirically, we're going to estimate, we're going to do initial volume regressions growth and entry using OLS, and then for the hazard, for the probability of exit, we're going to use random effects probe it, and then to actually look at the magnitude of these effects, we're not going to worry about coefficients too much. We're going to fit the empirical hazard, play with the variable of interest, and see how much that probability of exit, the conditional probability of exit, actually changes. All right, so this is just confirming results 3 and 4. So this is really nothing new in this paper, because these are results that we have in the literature that we now have sort of have at least a story that gives us some sort of intuition why things happen. So the hazard, the conditional probability you're going to exit if you've been around for T years, is decreasing in duration. The longer you're around, the less likely you are to exit the market. It's also decreasing in size, so the larger you are, the less likely you are to exit. All of the other sort of effects, the standard gravity effects are as they are in the literature. So the GDPs have sort of beneficially impact. The larger the importer GDP or the exporter GDP, the lower the hazard, the less likely. So larger countries have a longer lasting relationships or spells that are less likely to cease. Distance increases the likelihood of exit, contiguity decreases it, and the common language has no effect for the duration. In terms of growth within a relationship, that growth is decreasing with how long the spell has been active. It also decreases in size, and then larger countries have faster growing spells. Distance has a negative effect on that growth, contiguity positive, and common language and marginally positive.
So how much of that duration coefficient is the first year?
I don't know. I'll show you the plot so you can see.
Well, yeah, just
I have the duration is the log of time, right? So I can just put in dummies for
yeah,
every.
you could just dummy out.
Right, I can dummy it out and see. I've done it in other papers on this one. But when I do it, all of them are significant. They're all decreasing. Right? And yeah, the first two are sort of by far the largest ones. They have a huge reduction in hazard early on.
Yeah.
Sort of.
No, I'm thinking of the growth. Oh, I think of the growth coefficient.
The growth coefficient, if I kick out the first year or year 1 and 2,
0.
no, these are still there.
Yeah.
And they're actually, in terms of magnitude, I think this one is 0.09, and this one's right around that number. So I've actually done that. And they're still there.
So when you say hazard, do you estimate a hazard model?
Yes.
What are you, all these kind of funny proportionality assumptions for them to be?
So the random effects probably gets you outside of the proportional hazard assumption completely. There's no proportionality assumption there. It's nothing like the Cox model.
That's not a hazard either.
Sorry?
That's not a probability. So this is probability.
Right. No, but once you specifically model for duration and include the length in some shape or form, then you are actually estimating a hazard with probability. What the probability gets you out of is the proportionality assumption. So we're going to have, in terms of sort of identifying the effects of an agreement, we're going to use 4 variables to identify all of the various kinds of effects. We're going to have one dummy that flags all the countries that at some point have an agreement. So that's going to be, for US and Mexico, that will be 1 in every single year that we observe, because we just want to control for countries that eventually have an agreement. We're then going to have one dummy that identifies a period of time when an agreement is active. So for US and Mexico, we're going to essentially flag 1994 and onward. And then we're going to flag spells like C, things that start after the agreement. And then the last variable we're going to add is going to be a variable that tracks how long the agreement has actually been in place. Right? And we use the last one to see if the sort of stories about the importance of the phase-out effects of the phase-outs of tariffs over time and agreements that sort of are the reason why it takes 10 years for the aggregate levels of trade to double, whether you sort of see any sort of effects like that in this aggregate level. So we're going to have 4 variables that I'm going to take a look at. So these are the 3 results that we have in terms of the effect of an agreement. So in terms of the initial value, so this is what we're doing here is we're taking a look at the value of trade in year 1, and we're essentially comparing things that started before the agreement and things that start after the agreement. So countries that have an agreement at some point tend to have larger starting relationships, but once the agreement begins, their value plummets and drops, and it's in effect that's bigger than sort of how much larger their starting values are. In terms of the hazard, we have the countries that have an agreement have longer lasting relationships, or relationships that are less likely to cease. Once they sign an agreement, that probability goes down again, and I'll show you the magnitudes. But then for spells that start after the agreement, you have an increase in the hazard. So everything that starts after the agreement on average tends to has a higher probability of failure. And then in terms of growth, we again sort of have a similar story. Countries that have an agreement have slightly faster growing relationships. Once the agreement is in effect, that goes up, and then for things that start after, the growth rate goes down.
Can you just clarify, for spells started after the agreement, shouldn't we be adding the 2 coefficients?
Yeah.
So then it's 0, right?
So actually, I just noticed these are identical. I'm not sure. This might be a typo. I have to check that. And I actually think that's a copy-paste error. Because I'm going to get to MACRIS in a second, but I'm going to do MACRIS class. All right, so the problem with estimating hazard with probability is that these coefficients don't even tell you enough about the significance or the magnitude effect, because the magnitude really depends on everything that's in the model. Right? So what we're going to do is we're going to be fitting, yes?
Just between the difference between exists and in effect, so that there's an anticipation effect that still looms. But that should also be true for the EIA exists effect when they start negotiating.
Yeah, so we can throw in a variable that sort of counts the years off before the agreement kicks in.
And why the sign change in the first column? Between exists and in effect.
Oh, so countries that have an agreement will, not sure actually. Well, the model doesn't really sort of tell us a lot about the initial volumes of countries that have an agreement and don't have an agreement. Right? The prediction of the model is just about what this thing's going to. So
I'm sorry, now I'm confused. What is the dummy EIA?
This is a dummy that essentially just flags all the pairs that have an agreement. So if you sign an agreement in '94, this is a 1 in every single year.
In every year?
In
so,
every year.
It's a pair fixed effect.
It's a pair fixed effect, yeah.
It's a pair. Time. No, it's a pair.
It's a U.S.-Mexico fixed effect for the fact that
they will, in 1962, it's 1,
right.
because it knows somehow that it will have an agreement. That seems strange.
So this is much more selection, that countries that will have an agreement and
Yeah, just because it might look different to begin with.
So, yeah, it seems like there are other ways to maybe get at that, maybe certainly not at that.
So completely NAFTA. NAFTA wasn't signed in 62.
No.
But it's going to be a 1 in 62.
Yes. Yes.
Why? That really don't know. So they in 62 they knew in 94 that he signed it?
Unobservable characteristics.
It's another kind of
Countries are
characteristic. So
signed
countries
EIAs.
might have an agreement, and I just want to control for the fact that it might look different in
So I understand what you're trying to do. It seems to me, and I know you can't do it, you could do it in initial value. It seems like if you're going to go that far, you want to allow every pair to have permanent coefficients, rather than imagine that they're different based on the treatment. That's the problem, right? You're essentially allowing the pair to be treated in advance. And you should just allow if you're right, that 0.12, if that's really all that's going on, then the pairwise fixed effect is there. The problem with that is you're not going to be able to look at actual magnitude dimensions quite a bit.
So those EIAs that you showed us that fell apart, are those just countries disintegrate, or are they more likely to?
There are extremely few agreements that go up. So that reduction that I showed you in the plot was simply because the denominator for country pairs blew up when the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia fell apart. Blew up, relatively speaking. You suddenly had many more country pairs that exist, and none of them actually have any sort of agreement that one of breaking out both those countries. So it's sort of an artificial effect. It's not that you have a lot of agreements that sell. I mean, I think the largest number of agreements that actually cease is probably when Eastern European countries join the EU, because they all have to leave after that. Those are sort of the most significant, I think, trade agreements that sort of go out. All right, so in terms of sort of looking at, so I can do this sort of country, the pair fixed effect, but I can't do it in a hazard frame.
No, I know you definitely can do it, but I think you can rethink why you were putting that in, which is to capture something. You don't want the EIA in effect to be capturing something that is just about the kind of friendliness of the two countries. They happen to then formalize.
But why can you not do it on you were in a program, so it's a ground program?
Yeah. I can't throw thousands of dummies into it.
Well, then use another hazard.
Yeah.
I can use a Cox model, but the Cox is really not appropriate for this kind of data.
So you check the proportionality of the assumptions followed?
I think there's one duration paper that's, actually, I think everybody who's ever tried to test for proportionality, including myself when I was doing my PhD, finds that it fails every single time you trade data. It has never been shown to hold up. And so you can't sort of estimate it with C log and preserve the proportionality, but it's always going to fail. It's never really there. And then, the other thing that, like a sea level could, but COX, for example, can't deal with unanswered heterogeneity, which random effects probably can do a hell of a lot.
But if you're in the business of estimating probabilities rather than hazards, then by probability you could just as well use logit and the coincidence.
Logit actually preserves some proportionality. So probability gets you completely outside of the world of proportional hazards. Logit still preserves some aspects like that. All right, so to look at the magnitude of these effects, we're going to look at the fitted probability, the fitted hazard. And so in order to do that, we sort of need to have some notion of what a canonical agreement is going to look like, at least in terms of timing. And so we're going to assume that everything happens in year 6 for simplicity. So we're going to assume that an agreement starts in year 6 to an active relationship, and we're going to look at the effect for new spells. They're going to happen 6 years into the agreement. And none of these effects would change drastically if we move that 6 to a different point. All right, so this is a look at the fitted hazard for countries that have an agreement and don't have an agreement. So countries that have an agreement have an average of 90% lower hazard. When the effect of an agreement on active spells is reduction in the hazard right here. This averages to about a 55% lower hazard for things that are active once you start an agreement. For spells that start after the agreement, you have very little difference. So there, they just have a 4% lower hazard than the hazard of pre-agreement completed spells. So the comparison right here for the first 5 years is a comparison for the purple line of spells that start after the agreement to the spells that sort of U.S.-Mexico spells that started before NAFTA, started in 1989. And there's very little difference between those two. Right? So the savings that the beneficial effect that you have from an agreement is basically for things that are active.
Didn't one of the propositions say that the purple line should be above the other?
Above the...
That newly started spells have a higher hazard of failure.
Well, they do have a higher hazard than things that are active. Right?
Oh, that's what the proposition said? Not compared to prior.
Yeah. So it should be both. And these are slightly higher. You just can't see in the figure. I mean, if I zoomed it in, there'd be a small effect. There'd be a small difference here. It's not that difference. The difference here is not that big. There's still a difference here, though. So it's very small. So I'll show you. So here's some of the pure effects, what you're asking. Okay. If you have, do this one. So this one is 90%. That's the same. So the effect of the agreement actually starting is to reduce the hazard by 45% on its own. So if you set all the other dummies, all the other variables pertaining to agreements to 0, you would actually get a 45% reduction in the hazard. The effect on spells that start after the agreement is actually 73% higher hazard. It's because it all, but even
then any pair.
Then any pair, right? Because the first plot I gave you essentially for the new spells combines all of these three together, and that's sort of the lack. So it seems like a lack of a difference in the over 5 years. And then the effect of the length of an agreement averages to about 5% higher hazard. So there is an effect of how long the agreement has been, so the hazard keeps on sort of increasing, but at a very slow rate.
Sorry, so if you say that the total effect on spells starting after the agreement is the sum of the first three, right? Then magnitude is 9, right?
Yeah, but it's not a linear model, so right? it's the combination of the three numbers, but it's not a linear model, so I can't just add one.
So, I mean, just refresh the intuition here for these effects on the hazard. Is it everything coming from the fact that after the agreement, the relationship starts? I mean, you start with fewer, you start smaller, with fewer partners.
Right.
That's basically it.
Right.
And then if you condition on size, then this result should go away in the regression, no? Because it's all coming from different size at which you start.
Well, if I could condition the size of the business relation, but I can't do that. Right? There's,
Condition on the initial volume of trade.
you would do the
spell.
Empirically, it doesn't look like.
No, and in the theory it doesn't matter because the processes are independent. The process of the number of business relationships in the spell is coming from the joint process of acquiring a business relationship that's on the buyer side. But the size is independent of that process in which you generate buyers. So conditioning one is not going to kill the condition of the other. They both depend on the number of business relations, but are going to be independent of the size of this business because the stochastic process is independent.
All right, so in terms of growth of trade, see here's sort of the differences in sort of the theta growth rate. This is the effect of what happens on sort of the growth of things that are active on average, and then what the growth rate looks like for new spells. Right? So the growth rate jumps up for things that are already active, and the things that are after agreement will grow more slowly. In terms of initial volumes, so the effects are about that after the agreement becomes active, the initial volume sort of goes down by about 70%. That is the reduction in the starting size, and that continues sort of decreasing about 2% per year the longer the agreement is around.
And in the first statement now, that's including your super dummy? Okay.
Yes. This one?
No.
No, this is a growth fit. Right. So if you include the super dummy, then it's a net is a 5% lower, right? Because relative to countries that don't have an agreement, that's the comparison. All right, so how can we think about this? So if you go back to the Bayer-Bergström doubling of trade in a new paper looking at that agreements tend to have a stronger impact on the intensive margin in the short run, and that then effect sort of moves to the extensive margin. We show this sort of differential effect on this aggregate level. So the Bayer-Bergström Fink paper basically says in the immediate sort of effect of an agreement is that the intensive margin. Things that are active grow. Over time, though, most of that effect actually migrates from the intensive margin to the extensive margin. Right? So how can we actually then get, so if we have this sort of story that things that are around grow larger, but new stuff just sort of worse, it's smaller, it dies off more quickly, what's going on? Well, we can look at entry rates, right? So this is a result we can get out of the model, but we don't have it in paper yet. So do these agreements actually induce new entry? It turns out that yeah, they do. Right? And so what ends up happening is that once an agreement kicks in, you actually get a higher rate of entry formation of new spells between the countries that have an agreement. And that effect is there either if you look at gross entry or net entry when you take out all of the exits. So what ends up happening is you actually get this aggregate growth by there simply being a lot of small things, but there's just a bunch of them that start after the agreement. Okay.